All right, we will get started on time today. It's a real honor and a pleasure to introduce the president of the International Society for Evolution Medicine and Public Health, Barbara Natterson. She's a visiting professor at Harvard in the Department of Human Evolution and a professor at UCLA School of Medicine. She's best known for her book Ubiquity and her new book Wildhood. In both cases, really looking at the common patterns across all animals, both that help us understand human pathologies and also development. It was selected by the Nobel Committee to be to be the theme of their Nobel conference last year, and she was the keynote speaker for that. It has been translated into 7 languages. This is the ZOOBIQUITY book, and has been selected for a number of prizes, including the Discover magazine's Best Book of the Year. The Wildhood is a wonderful book. I read it when it came out last fall. It is a gold mine of insights by combining the systematic review process from medicine with the phylogenetic analysis from comparative biology, and bringing together those two things just leads to a number of discoveries. You'll hear some of them today. If you go to the public lecture, you'll hear more of them tonight. And it's an example of the kind of thing that ASU is really devoted to. That is the insights and discoveries you can make by combining fields and the innovation there. So please welcome one of the leading innovators in our field of evolutionary medicine, Barbara Natterson.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlo. Everybody can hear me okay? Cool. All right. Well, first of all, I am really excited to be here in this community, in this room. You are my people. I love to talk about evolution and medicine. And, the whole world is not as engaged as those of us here are today. So thank you for inviting me and making the whole day possible. And I have to also say it's a particular thrill to give a lecture in a room that has a poster that says, "Our mission is to improve human health by establishing evolutionary biology as an essential basic science for medicine worldwide." Wow. I was like, that is fantastic. I want to carry it with me everywhere. So I'm just going to go ahead and start by having you look at this fly. And actually, I'd like to turn the lights off. It's probably, can someone give me a hand here so I can just move along? So what you're looking at is a housefly, and you're looking at the heart of a housefly. So the earliest hearts evolved in invertebrates about 600 or 700 million years ago, because early animals were becoming more complex and their systems were becoming larger and more diverse, and a need arose to develop a system to connect these different systems and to deliver resources and information. Well, I'm a cardiologist and an evolutionary biologist, and in my work, I look across species, across evolutionary time, and across fields to identify information and resources that I believe would be beneficial to other fields. And that as part of an effort to make science, let's say, smarter, more holistic, and frankly to tear down many of the culturally created scientific silos that really are a threat to innovation. And truly there is no better place in the world that I know of than right here at ASU to be sharing that message. So we're going to start with a fly, and I'm going to now tell you that over the next 45 minutes to 50 minutes, I'm going to make the case that by looking across species and evolutionary time, we can better understand the nature of human vulnerability to physical illnesses and psychiatric illnesses, biobehavioral illnesses. Understand resilience in humans and other animals, and I mean resilience in both the individual lifetime, the one animal's lifetime, but also the concept of resilience over the course of many generations and even across taxa. By looking across species and evolutionary time, we can accelerate biomedical innovation by looking at evolutionary processes and moving information across fields. And finally, by looking across species in evolutionary time, we can improve our awareness of our place in the universe and frankly move beyond human exceptionalism, which I would define for the purposes of today as unexamined assumptions about the uniqueness of vulnerabilities to our species. These unexamined assumptions are blindfolds that have prevented us from reaching far across fields and far across phylogenetic categories for insights, which, when we do, allow us to make connections, see patterns and trends, which in turn allow us to generate better hypotheses, do better science, and ultimately improve the health not just of humans, but of life on Earth. Well, I only have 50 minutes, and that's a tall order, big promises, and so let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to start by sharing very quickly my personal journey and the methodology that Carlo mentioned. Really, there's not a lot of time here to cover what I want to cover. So what I'm going to do is literally just brush the surface of it. And please email me, talk to me. I'd love to share what I do and give you resources. I teach a couple of classes where we actually use this methodology. I'm then going to give you some examples of how this approach can improve our understanding of vulnerability to cardiovascular diseases, developmental disorders, and biobehavioral issues. I'm going to move on as part of this, and it'll be a little interlaced, to talk about resilience and how this approach can allow us to better understand the emergence of resilience, again, within an individual and over generations, with examples from heart disease, from development and biobehavioral disorders. And finally, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about human exceptionalism and talking about how we can collectively work to chip away at some of this blindfold. All right, well, I want to give you a little bit about my journey. And so I grew up in LA, and I am actually the product of what my parents used to jokingly call a mixed marriage. And they called it that because both of my parents are psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapists. My dad is actually a Freudian psychoanalyst. He's still living, 96. And my mother is a psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapist, and she was a Jungian. So that was the big joke growing up, that it was a mixed marriage. So I don't know. Anyway, I then went off to college, and at the time I did not realize that I was stepping into a bit of history that would become pretty salient for me many, many decades later. But my freshman biology teacher was E.O. Wilson. And by the time I was a senior in the history science department, I had convinced Stephen Gould to be my thesis advisor. And so these two giants were, at that time, between 1979 and 1983, were actually having these wars, the sociobiology wars. So that was college. I then went to medical school, and, this is a whistle-stop tour. I graduated, and I decided I would follow in the family footsteps. I'd go into the family business, which was psychiatry, and I trained fully as a psychiatrist. And I have to say, when I look back, I realized that I entered the field of psychiatry at a really interesting break point. So the tradition of psychoanalysis really dominated psychiatric residencies until biological psychiatry started to emerge. And so when I was a resident, it was 1987, and we were being trained in the old school way, but Prozac was released to the public. And that kind of marked really the beginning of the popularization of a biological approach to psychiatry. I ended up going on to have more training. I trained in internal medicine and ultimately cardiology, and then spent the next 20 years as a cardiologist at UCLA, as a professor of medicine, doing a lot of teaching, doing some research, but mostly I was taking care of human beings with heart attacks and high cholesterol and hypertension. And then I ended up having the opportunity to participate in the care of some of the patients at the LA Zoo who had cardiovascular issues. And this went on over the course of several years, and I had a really extraordinary learning experience where all of a sudden I was hearing about diseases that I had only considered in human beings as a physician, and I was learning about them in other animals, and really it was eye-opening for me. But what it actually was a connection back to my decades earlier, my experience, my interest in evolutionary biology. At that time, I had never heard of evolutionary medicine. It was just that these connections started to come together. I went on to focus on this ultimately over several years. I pulled back from clinical practice and started focusing exclusively on trying to understand the connections between human health, animal health, and evolutionary biology. Ended up writing this book, ZOOBIQUITY, and starting conferences, bringing together veterinary schools and medical schools, which remarkably, in 2008, 2009, there were none that were dedicated to that. And actually now the ZOOBIQUITY Conference have become the premier conferences bringing together veterinary schools and medical schools around the world, and I'm very proud of that, although there's a lot of work to do. When I first started writing the book, I had intended on keeping it strictly medical. And there were some strategic reasons for that. I was nervous about doing this. I had left my full-time faculty position as a cardiologist to do this, and I thought it would be heart disease, cancer, autoimmune disorders, etc. But over the course of spending a lot of time in veterinary settings and talking to veterinarians and talking to wildlife biologists and others, I started really getting educated. At that time, I knew nothing about psychopathology in other animals, was very ignorant, but I started learning about a wide range of disorders, compulsions, from that tail chasing to compulsive overeating, to some other compulsions, and seeing parallels, potential parallels anyway, with conditions I was familiar with already. And some of these were interesting scientifically. In this case, you'll see the owner looking under the bed, and you all laugh. But what I started noticing and I began teaching was how this can inform us about stigma. Because as you look at that and you check how you felt, and then you look at this and check how you feel, it begins to open up questions and ideas about not only stigma of mental illness, but how we feel about ourselves versus animals. And so I became really, really more and more engaged in that world, and ultimately half of the chapters in the book had to do with biobehavioral disorders. Well, over the course now of about 10 years, I increasingly was thinking and continue to ask these questions. How can we use insights from veterinary medicine, wildlife biology, and behavioral ecology to improve human health? And more specifically, and this is what I'm going to talk about today, how can we identify the connections? How can we translate them? And how can we deliver this research, especially the research that has salience for human health? How can we deliver it to physicians, clinician investigators who need it the most? And I want to take a moment to say that I think there are there are many reasons why this is not happening. Some of it has to do with cultural tradition, right? Human medicine and veterinary medicine have been separated for quite a long time, at least in the Western tradition. We know that science typically, the more reductionistic you get, the more you move toward nano-inspection, the more heralded you tend to be, and so that there's a tendency towards this and not that. But I think one of the fundamental reasons that there is not this push, this delivery of resources in the form of information, one of the central issues is that there are many, many unexamined assumptions among outstanding scientists about systems in other animals, and I'm not necessarily talking about primates. I'm not necessarily even talking about mammals. I'm talking about looking broadly phylogenetically. There are many unexamined assumptions about the non-conserved or non-relevance of those systems to human life. And so I think there's an educational function that's a real opportunity for our community. So originally, I was thinking, I was going to the zoo, I was thinking about evolution and animals, I was learning so much, but I really did not have any kind of a framework to take this content and pull it into my work as a physician, as a teacher. But I was lucky that I had studied evolutionary biology because I did know about Tinbergen, and I had encountered this concept of levels of explanation. And everyone in this room is certainly familiar with this Tinbergean framework where in order to understand a behavior, there is a mechanistic explanation, a developmental explanation. Both of these, of course, are proximate. But what's also important, and what was really what Tinbergen is credited with really pushing up to the front, is that in order to really be holistic and complete in understanding why it's imperative that an adaptive perspective is brought to the question, and the only way to understand and generate a testable adaptive hypothesis is to look phylogenetically. Well, this seemed like a good framework in one sense, but on the other hand, how on earth could this apply to heart attacks, breast cancer, bipolar disorder? Where was the glue? Where was the connective tissue? And what I did was to sort of take a step back and say, all right, what happens in medicine when we're asked why? Because after all, what Tinbergen was doing with his four-part structure of causation was getting at the four levels, the four answers to why. So medicine, as it is today, is nearly 100% proximate in its explanations. I'll give you an example. If I were on call in the CCU at UCLA tomorrow night, and Mr. Jones came in with a heart attack, a classic, myocardial infarction, and he was going to the cath lab, he's being redlined to the cath lab, and his worried wife says to me, "Doctor, why did this happen?" I would, as I have many times and cardiologists around the world do, responded with one of a dozen explanations. One thing I might say would be, well, actually, a small blood clot, a little bit, smaller than, the tip of a pencil eraser, lodged in an area of the artery that blocked off the blood, and there was, cessation of blood downstream, and the muscle started to die. Absolutely accurate, pretty proximate. But I could even give an even more proximate explanation, a more reductionistic explanation. I could say, well, because your husband has been, maybe he has cancer, maybe he's smoking, his platelets are stickier than they should be, that the platelets came together and that's what caused this heart attack, right? I might give a developmental explanation, and I might say, well, actually, underlying all of this is atherosclerosis, which is a process which is progressive in its developmental, and typically Americans start to have plaque, cholesterol buildup in the arteries of their heart and aorta by the time they're in their second decade of life. So I have given those explanations many times. What no one does that I know of in medicine is to answer in a Tinbergean way. And it wouldn't be appropriate, obviously, in that context. But it is interesting to even ask, well, how on earth would you? What could you learn from looking phylogenetically, right? So the first question that should be going through your minds is, well, do other animals have atherosclerosis, right? And if they do, why do they have vascular endothelium, which is where all the action is in developing atherosclerosis, that makes them vulnerable to it? Is there a trade-off, right? So you're kind of thinking like evolutionary biologists. Well, I realized that if I was going to make any progress with the Tinbergean model, I needed to find a way to think phylogenetically. And it wasn't going to be enough to look for animals who had disease, because that wasn't what I was really interested in. What I was interested is in taxa, groups of animals who had vulnerability to disease, vulnerability to atherosclerosis. And so I began expanding how I understood the idea, the concept of vulnerability, moving from what I had been taught in medical school and what I had taught as a professor to a more evolutionarily informed understanding of vulnerability. So typically, if you ask a physician about if their patient is vulnerable to, let's say, lung cancer, the physician will give an answer that has to do with probably lifestyle well, they're not a smoker, or this is where they lived, or these were their occupational exposures. All of those expressions are about intra-specific vulnerability, right? It's all within Homo sapiens. That is what the field of epidemiology is, essentially. It is characterizing and stratifying intraspecific vulnerability. Does that make sense? But there's another way of thinking about vulnerability I began to kind of come upon, which is to really think phylogenetically. And so instead of asking about vulnerability within human beings, to ask what non-human animals are vulnerable to these diseases. And that's sort of the framework and the foundation for the approach that I've used and now, and a lens that I've been creating and refining and making better and worse over a decade. So the sequence of events, this is the process that I use, is that I essentially look at a problem, a disorder, let's say it's a medical disorder, and this is the process from disorder to hypothesis. And the goal is to use this process to generate a novel, testable, adaptive hypothesis. And so the first issue is I need to find the components of vulnerability, because you're not going to get very far if you try to search for a disease in other animals. You'll get some reports, some not, but you can make progress by breaking it down. I'm not going to go into this too much, but you'll see what I'm talking about. I conduct what's called a systematic review, and I'll explain what that is in a moment, to identify other animals who have vulnerability to this component of vulnerability. I then look at and analyze these phylogenies for patterns and trends, which give me insights potentially about what might be going on. I correlate these species that I find this vulnerability in. I look at their life histories to see whether I can understand if there's a fitness-enhancing aspect to the vulnerability. And finally, based on what I can correlate, I generate a hypothesis. All right, so here's an example. This is actually just a rubric. So here's the disorder. I break it down into components of vulnerability and take these components of vulnerability and look for them to identify species which have this. Now, let me tell you what this is. This is essentially a funnel that is used to describe the process of systematic review. So until 1991, let's say that I'd had a heart attack on the corner of LeConte and Westwood Boulevard, and I was taken to the CCU. In 1991, whether or not I got a beta blocker when I had my heart attack would completely depend on whether Professor Fogelman was the attending physician that week or whether it was Professor Weiss, and those were my professors. Each of them were senior. They were fantastic master clinicians who practiced something we used to call the art of medicine. And what that meant was what they knew and how they practiced medicine was related to a long experience, and they read and they studied, but ultimately they were constrained in their knowledge by what one human being in one lifetime could learn without the internet. But in 1991, which is the year that the web went public, things started to change. And essentially, to make a very long story very short, by using powerful search strategies, we were able to, instead of relying on somebody's experience, one clinician, we were able to ask questions and look at any study that weighed in at all on this question. The studies did not have to be structured similarly. They did not have to be looking for the same kinds of issues, but we were pulling things together and then doing meta-analyses to see whether we could put power behind our question. And that became the basis of evidence-based medicine. Evidence-based medicine has been successful for a few reasons, but for nothing has been more powerful than systematic review. We now know that if you have a heart attack, your cardiologist had better put you on a beta block, or she'd better have a pretty good reason not to. We know that now from these meta-analyses. Well, what essentially I realized I was trying to do was to identify component, this component of vulnerability, sort of the kernel. It would be beta blocker use, let's say, but the kernel in a wide range of animal studies, and identify species who at least had been reported in the literature to have this component of vulnerability. Now, let me give you an example of how this works, and let me take a moment to just say the obvious, and I suspect you are thinking this already. What's in the peer-reviewed literature about animals with disease? Well, almost exclusively animals that we have a lot of contact with. There are, that PLOS paper suggested, I think there are 8.7 million other species that we know of less than 10%. Whatever the number is, the animals with which we have direct contact, whether it's domestic animals, whether it's zoo animals, whether it's agricultural animals, the occasional wild animal, those are the animals that appear in these in the literature. And so, in the case of what we're doing, the absence of evidence, the non-presence of this component of vulnerability in an animal really does not have particular significance. But we look where the light is, and that's what I started to do. So let's start with a cardiovascular example. The paradox of vasovagal syncope. I've had vasovagal syncope before. I'm pretty sure some of you have also. It's a fainting episode that happens when you're scared, when you're stressed, when you're in a lot of pain. Blood draws, first-time fathers in delivery rooms. Here's Kim Bassinger demonstrating for us. Okay, now it is called paradoxical syncope. Syncope is the term for fainting. And it's a very important problem. It's very common. And if you want to break it into its components of vulnerability, there are many. I'm sorry, this is not filled out, but one of the things that happens is that the baroreceptors in the heart and great vessels, the pressure receptors become sensitized. You see vasodilation, that is the blood vessel, the smooth muscle in the arterioles starts to relax, and you see vasodilation. There tends to be a high adrenergic tone. Catecholamines are, a high concentration of catecholamines. But central to all of it is a slowing of the heart, something called bradycardia. And it turns out that fear-induced bradycardia, what's called alarm bradycardia, is a component of vulnerability that you can search. Now, what was exciting for me about tackling this as one of the first cardiovascular issues is that everybody talks about this as a paradox. Why? Because it doesn't make sense that fear, which should, you'd think, trigger a fight-flight, is going to be triggering the opposite, right? Tachycardia, acceleration would be the expected. This feels paradoxical. So what I did, this is one of the earliest examples that I used, was to look for alarm or fear bradycardia. I used formal methods of systematic review with the whole prism, all of it, and then identified taxa in which at least one animal exhibited it, and saw that, pretty much across chordates, there were reports of some individuals, right, having a bradycardic response to restraint or pre-predation. And at that point, it becomes really interesting. You're seeing this phenomenon, this autonomic physiology that is potentially conserved across several hundred millions of years. And the question is, can we connect it to life history in some way that can generate an adaptive hypothesis? Well, I started looking back at some of these studies and found some wonderful ones. This is one of my favorite. This was a study where they looked at fawn, right, baby deer. They put telemetry leads, EKGs on them. They played recordings of wolf howls, and they watched as the heart rates decelerated abruptly and this tonic immobility ensued. Well, I think it's pretty obvious how this might be fitness enhancing. That certainly from an anti-predation perspective, immobility, tonic immobility is a pretty widespread strategy. We know that many hunting predators use acoustic signals, visual signals, motion, and this could be a strategy. But there's even more to it. So we've looked at the component of vulnerability, the phylogenetic pattern. We've correlated it with life history. But is it adaptive? And you can begin to think about the kinds of experiments that you could develop to test that. But just because there's lots of video on the internet, I want to show you one example. There are many. I was at the San Diego Zoo last week with the new executive director of the zoo. He's the new CEO, and he ran Disney Nature, which was their big film. They put together all the wildlife, and he was telling me that they have hundreds and hundreds of examples of these. So anyway, in the moments before this video, this young impala has been chased by a cheetah. And there's the cheetah, and the hyena has intimidated the cheetah out of the spoils. But look what happens. Wow. Did you catch that? The impala survives. Now, I can't tell you whether that impala was not bradycardic. But ungulates as a taxa have a lot of alarm bradycardia. And the idea that a slowed heart and the immobility that ensues could be adaptive transforms how we understand something as paradoxical to something that is adaptive. Vasovagal syncope is only paradoxical if you have a Homo sapiens-centric lens on. As soon as you expand your view, as soon as you as a physician remember that our young species, our 200 or 300,000-year-old species, retains a tremendous amount of autonomic physiology with not just other mammals, but birds and reptiles, amphibians, and fish, all of a sudden we are looking at the potential to generate testable hypotheses. Well, there's another component to this, which is to go back from the species vulnerability, which is what we were just doing, back to individual vulnerability. Because what was fascinating as I was reviewing the studies I found was that there was a trend, which was most of the studies indicated that the animals who were bradycardic were younger. They were juveniles. And in fact, in human beings, the mean age for first presentation of vasodepressor syncope is 13 years old. And many people grow out of it as they head into their 20s. And so this suggests that there is some ontogenetic developmental vulnerability, which is likely adaptive. I think a very reasonable adaptive hypothesis for this is that when until a young animal has the strength to mount a successful flight, or at least have the possibility of mounting a successful flight, there may be a developmentally entrained parasympathetic response that is adaptive. So all of a sudden, what we're doing is we're now shining light on something that's been observed clinically in human beings for, at least a century, and we're casting it in light of a shared connection based on the shared developmental phase of life, which was something I had never thought about before. Well, let's use that developmental perspective to talk about adolescence. And I don't know if you just caught that young man jump across that gully. It's like, wow. Everybody knows that some adolescents, not all, but some adolescents take risks. And they can be all kinds of risks. Now, what's interesting from an evolutionary perspective is that this is from 2017. Actually, this is, I have another one. 2017 is almost the same. I don't know how that got substituted. But essentially, between 12 and 19, you have this very significant, in both males and females, but you have this very significant increase in mortality in these pre-reproductive, for the most part, pre-reproductive human animals. Well, that is really interesting, and that's a tantalizing something to go after. Now, there are explanations that have been given, but no one had asked the broader phylogenetic question, well, is this unique to human adolescents? And part of the problem was there was a literature that suggested that adolescence was uniquely human, created by our culture, our modern culture. And it's a long story how I began teaching a course called Coming of Age on Planet Earth, where we start with Margaret Mead and then we expand our comparative perspective. But adolescence is not unique to human beings. There is a transitional period between the onset of puberty and when a mature adult emerges. And there are many remarkable, striking similarities, many differences, obviously, as well. Well, let's use this approach to really penetrate this evolutionary question, this enigma. We had a paradox, now we've got an enigma. So this is the CDC chart. So you can see that between the ages of 15 and let's go from here to here, you're looking at between 10 and 14, the accidents, unintended injury, which is accidents basically, is at 860, boom, it pops up to 13,000 and then it pops up again. But this is really a big delta. And that's notable. Well, if I asked you why, many of you in this room would probably are familiar with the really path-breaking, and I really think this has been a tremendous revolution in how we understand developmental behavior, understanding that there are unique characteristics to a human adolescent brain. Raise your hand if you've heard about the adolescent brain. Everyone has, right, most of it. And this was the New Yorker cartoon, and it says, young man, go to your room and come back until you're free, stay there until your cerebral cortex matures. Well, the one-liner that our students, when I teach this course, the students actually, I ask them, what's this adolescent brain about? And they're adolescents, even though they don't realize it, because they're 18 to 23. And they say, oh, we have underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. And that's kind of that's a simplification, but that's the idea that the PFC, which is sort of the governor that sort of controls the limbic drives from below, is coming online and is fully formed here, but as adolescents, it's so-so. And that results in the impulsivity and all that. And it's not wrong. But is it complete? It's a proximate explanation. It is a mechanistic explanation, which actually, by Tinbergen's criteria, is not holistic. It lacks the other criteria, the phylogenetic and the adaptive. So I ran it through this format, and this is called a prisma diagram. It's something you do when you're doing a systematic review. And the point is that this happened over a year and a half. I had to have some definitions for what an adolescent was in different species. And the long and the short of it is, animals who are big enough to be outside of the direct protection of their parents and yet lack experience. So I'm talking about fledgling birds in their first days and weeks out of the nest. I'm talking about dispersing mammals in their first period outside of the nest. Even I'm talking about some fish species, and we're going to get to this in a second. Remember, yes, it's true, most fish, there isn't significant parental care, but about 20% of fish species there is. But even in the fish who are not getting parental care, you see smolts, who are adolescent salmon, right, having very high mortality when they first are let out to head toward the ocean. And remarkably, and this is not part of this lecture, if you look at the mortality of wild smolts, so you know when you go to the restaurant, they say, this is wild-caught salmon or this is farm salmon. Well, it turns out wild salmon smolts who have grown up as fry with exposure to predators and have some social learning are much safer in those first days than the kind of more protected farm smolts. All right, so indeed what I found is that there is a very significant taxa chordate-wide elevation in mortality. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but just to share some of the interesting findings, adolescent animals who are dispersing are disproportionately victims of roadkill. And I don't have time to get into all of that, but when you read about a wild animal in an urban area, very often they're an adolescent, whether it's mountain lions or koalas, and there's a whole literature about this. And not surprisingly, adolescent whales who are independent but inexperienced are also disproportionately victims of whale strikes in shipping corridors. Adolescent animals have a high mortality, in part also because they are easy prey. They are predator naive, which is the term that behavioral ecologists use for that. And there are predators who take advantage of that. There is a subspecies of orca, of killer whale, called the Biggs migrating orcas, who specialize, that is, they exclusively feed on adolescent. They're called subadults. You have to kind of play with the nomenclature. They leave the calves. There's only 1 or 2 calves that are killed. Calves are too much trouble. They're with the big bulls, the mothers and the bull escorts. And adults, it's a big risk. But it's a pretty high probability of some calories if you've got an inexperienced predator-naive humpback. And there's some fascinating components to this. So this is the iconic view of the wildebeest crossing, right? I think this is the Mara River. And you know that the crocs wait there. Well, one really, I love this. This was Dan Mulcahy, who was a U.S. He's a veterinarian for the national parks. He directed me to this when I asked. What you're going to see is there's tens of thousands of these wildebeest. They're hot, they're thirsty, and here's this river. And what you're going to see are the young ones jumping right in. Oh, it looks so good. Boom, nice live ones jumping in. But I want you to look at these older, bigger animals. And do you see that? And, right, those are the footsteps of experience. And the young ones that are jumping in. So being predator naive, being inexperienced puts you in danger. Well, I want to offer the flip side of vulnerability, which is resilience, which in a sense is the adaptation of learning, which is intense across chordates. Even in fish, I've learned so much about social learning in fish and even direct forms of pedagogy that there's a huge literature, again, to my point, that I believe has salience for human life, but which isn't part of the normal set of resources that educators think to look at or would even know how to translate. But it's an opportunity. So it turns out there are some adaptive learning safety behaviors that adolescent animals, that we see wild animals engaging in. One of them is something called predator inspection. And these are, just to go back for a sec, this is a lone adolescent meerkat approaching a Cape cobra, who's a predator, and joined by a conspecific. Predator inspection is typically done in groups, and they're smelling, learning, and it's pretty taxa-wide. I did a phylogeny of predator inspection, and you see it from even in some mobile invertebrates. So it's a pretty remarkable thing that I had never heard about, and adolescents do it more than others. This was these are actually some Thompson gazelle. You see the cheetah in the foreground. This is an adolescent that's coming forward toward the cheetah. I think that's pretty clear. So are his or her conspecifics, and they're pausing. They're not fleeing. They're watching, and they're learning. And in Fitzgibbon's amazing study, she studied thousands of approaches of cheetahs by both adolescent and adult Thompson gazelle, and she quantified what happened. Well, predator inspection is risky, and some of the adolescents do get attacked and eaten. Overall, the experience of predator inspecting increases the likelihood that they will survive to adulthood. So it's a really interesting example, potentially, of thinking about how risk-taking might actually be adaptive in other animals, and generating a hypothesis that, again, some of this autonomic physiology, which is highly entrained in decision-making in humans, whether some component of the autonomic physiology related to predator inspection in stickleback fish, in bats, in Thompson gazelle, in meerkat, is present in humans, and can that help to explain and frame almost as a mismatch, in a sense, or a kind of retained physiology which is now maladaptive, risk-taking, and that in our species, and that 6-fold increase in mortality. There's more to it, but I want to just end. Randy, Carla, what time is it? Okay, I'm going to go quickly so we'll have time for questions. So I promised I would also talk about developmental vulnerability around biobehavioral disorders, psychiatric disorders. I call them biobehavioral, by the way, because when I talk with groups of veterinarians, they don't like the term psychiatric. And so I don't mind biobehavioral. I kind of like it, but I'm not trying to make a point by using that term other than that kind of cultural sensitivity. But I want you to look down here at So we looked at accidents, yeah? And now let's look at number 2. And number 2 is suicide. And that, as you may know, this is from 2017. That number is getting worse, not better. And the incidence of anxiety and depression and suicidality among high school students, even some middle school students, is on the rise. And that is something, obviously, that could not be of greater importance for us to understand. And there is a connection, people think, by association with social media use. And so here's the question. Can we apply this methodology to penetrate the question, why are rates of anxiety and depression rising among 14 to 24-year-olds while remaining flat in other groups? And what is the nature of the association with social media? Saying that it's connected to social media is a proximate explanation that does not contain the framework that can give us a holistic understanding truly of why in the Tinbergean sense. But my God, social media is uniquely human. I mean, it's what could be more specific to human culture than, come on, Instagram. And yet, maybe we can find some component of vulnerability in other animals that can begin to inform us about the nature of vulnerability. And so let's look at mood disorders and components of vulnerability. Let's go through this again. And one component of vulnerability is having a serotonergic network, having a social brain that is entrained with serotonergic systems and networks which respond to interactions with other individuals, humans or other individuals. So in human beings, the serotonergic system is obviously engaged with mood. I mean, let's face it, what are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac and Paxil and Lexapro, other than drugs that basically, among other things, increase available serotonin? Not to oversimplify it, but we're going to just make it reductive right now. And so if you put that through a systematic review, serotonergic networks and a social brain entrainment, what I found was that, indeed, from crustaceans, there are studies of lobsters, crayfish, a number of fish species, amphibians, reptiles, anole lizards, there's some really interesting work, mammals and birds, in which changes in an individual's status within that group, ascent or descent, causes activation in unique ways of serotonergic networks. And I'm not going to say up, down. To trivialize it and simplify it is to be wrong, but I just want to point this out. So we're talking about two lizards in a fight. It's like a world wrestling thing. One is going to be down, right? There's a clear loser and a winner. And we're going to see, again, this is the target animal. This is a bullied duck, and you can see that usually in animal hierarchies, the targeted animals, the bullies, are at the bottom, right, of the hierarchy. And this is actually the target animal, this pig. You can see that, right? He's being cast away. Okay, so we're looking widely. We're looking at reptiles. We're looking at birds. We're looking at mammals, at these hierarchies, right? Now, what is the connection here? Well, if you go back to the original schooling fish who appeared about, it was a little after, maybe 50 to 100 million years after the Cambrian radiation, you see, you can look at schooling fish, and while they may look like clones, they're not. Each one is an individual. They are there's males, there's females. They have, some are healthy, some are sick. Some of them have had trauma that they have been, had near-miss experiences. And above all else, each one of them knows where they are on the status hierarchy. Fish brains, the social brain networks of fish, are so developed that they can accomplish something remarkable. If you take two fish out of the tank, fish A and fish B, and they fight, and fish A wins and fish B loses, and then you take fish A and you pop her back into the school with the others, but you keep fish B outside in a tank where she can see what's going on, just by watching how fish A, who she has lost to, right, relates to every other fish. When you put fish B back in, she knows where she belongs. It's called transitive rank inference. It's extremely ancient. And that argues that the social brains, the relationships between individuals, and that's what this is. People talk about hierarchies, but you know what I like to think about? Relationships, because those are individuals who are feeling. I'm going to say that with air quotes. I want to be very conservative with that word. And and many of you have seen this already, you see that there are changes in neurobiology when an individual wins or loses. So these are zebrafish, and this is a little victory dance that the winner's doing, and you can see the gills moving, but there's psychomotoric retardation, there's withdrawal, lack of initiation. And in conjunction with that, these studies that appeared on the systematic review that I then applied to my phylogeny show that these serotonergic systems are activated in one direction and another for the winner and the loser. And these are comparative experiences. And, you can look at the serotonergic pathways here. But essentially, here's fish A and fish B. The contest happens. The pathways become more intensified in one and less in another. And all of this got me to thinking that perhaps serotonin was actually, or these serotonergic networks, was the lingua franca between status and mood. And so what? What does that have to do with social media? Well, I have a 21-year-old and a 23-year-old, and they're kind of out of it now, but when my daughter was about 18 or so and social media was really she would live and die by social media and these posts, and I did not understand it. But I now have a better understanding, because what is social media, or a significant part of it other than comparison? It's about how many followers, how many likes. It's, do I look as good or worse? And it is, literally status, the word status is a part of it. Now, I don't want to reduce it to simplification in a way that makes it untrue, but I believe there is some fundamental way that we can start talking about neurobiology. I'm not talking about fish biologists. I'm not talking about evolutionary biology. I'm talking about psychologists or counselors or even adolescents themselves or anybody who has mood variation, and begin thinking about the biology of comparison, or the evolutionary biology of comparison, which I would submit originated at least as long ago as those fish, 470 million years. And to kind of refine it, and I'll end in a few slides, the ancient social brain networks that evolved in our fish ancestors evolved to help animals navigate their relationships. I'm going to say relationships instead of hierarchy. It's the same, and these underlie, that is, the building blocks of human affective systems. Many of them can be found conserved, not completely conserved, but elements of them conserved in living teleost fish. And that is a connection that is not, we don't typically think about. Individuals' relationships and this biology of comparison having this ancient profile. And this then, for me, has really opened my eyes to something that I don't think I ever appreciated enough, even though I trained as a psychiatrist, which is how painful emotional pain is, actually. There's a tendency to delegitimize emotional pain and legitimize physical pain. But if the evolutionary framework is correct, and I believe it is, that sensations evolved to motivate and shape an individual's behavior toward increased fitness. We see, that physical pleasure comes from these consumptions, for example. And that rising in status, of course, is very fitness enhancing for fish and for birds. In a flock, in a school, high status animals have more access to food. They occupy safer positions in their groups. They have, there's many, many survival benefits. And so physical pleasure in response to these consumptive experiences, emotional pleasure, air quotes, if you'll allow me the liberty, with status elevation. And the inverse is that physical pain with existential threat, and emotional pain, if you'll forgive me, with status descent, which for a group living animal is an existential crisis. And I like to talk about this now because I really do think this helps to put physical and emotional pain on the same plane. Because if this is true, in order for the pain of social descent to actually shape the animal's behavior to cause it to reverse whatever it was doing, it has got to hurt. And as social dissent gets worse and worse, and we see in these studies and the systematic review that serotonin activation changes, in some it gets less and less, I'll just say that, presumably that sensation gets more and more intense. And I don't think I ever understood until I had this evolutionary framework how a human being could feel so much pain that they wanted to end their life. And yet I had patients who, as a psychiatrist, who expressed that and one who did. So I'm going to round things out by, I'm going to move past adverse early life events, and these are mouth-brooding fish. This is parental care, and I'm going to move past that. There's some really interesting work looking at some of the adverse puppyhood experiences in dogs and the likelihood of problems later in life, which really parallels a big focus of the NIH right now, which is adverse childhood events and that role in adult disease, as I know you're aware of. And I'm just going to end by going back to Nico Tinbergen, who is sort of the hero of this story. Because Tinbergen won the Nobel Prize in 1973 for founding the field of animal behavior, along with two other scientists. One was Carl von Frisch, the bee biologist, and the other was the much more famous Konrad Lorenz, who you know from his work on attachment with the geese. Well, Lorenz and Tinbergen were really, I call it a scientific bromance. They loved each other. And they worked together in the spring of 1937, and that's when they founded the field at Lorenz's beautiful, picturesque lake house in Austria. And I know this because I've spent the last now almost 7 years I spent 2 summers at the Bodleian Library at Oxford going through the letters that he sent when he was younger, and then all of the other correspondence. His wife burned a lot after his death, is actually at the Harvard Pusey Library, and so I taught a seminar on Tinbergen, and we went through all those letters. Tinbergen and Lorenz loved each other before the war, but by 1939, the war was in full blossom, and Lorenz became a leading figure, scientific figure in the SS. He was a leader there's an arm of the SS which had to do with racial, choosing who was racially pure and not pure. Whereas Tinbergen resisted the Nazification of the University of Leiden, ended up in a hostage camp and then a concentration camp. And after the war, Tinbergen became depressed, suicidally depressed. And it's really a remarkable story of how and why he was able to overcome it. But I think that there is a framework that we can apply that allows us to look back not 47 years, which was when he won the Nobel Prize, but 470 million years to when these early groups of animals began forming relationships and evolved these social brain networks, which are composed of what are now the building blocks of the emotional affective centers in human beings. I want to conclude by reading just very quickly the words that were accompanied the announcement that the Nobel Prize in Medicine would be given to bird biologists, bee biologists, and it went like this. The discoveries made by this year's Nobel Prize laureates were based on studies of insects, fishes, and birds, and might thus seem to be of only minor importance for human physiology or medicine. However, their conclusions likely will hold true for all species, including for that which, in shameless vanity, has baptized itself Homo sapiens. Thank you for your attention.
Let me turn off the lights.
Okay.
We have time for some questions.
Here's a fun, go ahead.
While you're waiting, I will add to your Tinbergen and Lorenz study because I work in Lorenz's institute. And after the war, he was taken to a Russian prison camp where almost everybody died. But he, as a biologist, survived by catching blue bottle flies all day long and eating the bottles of that. And during that time, he wrote an entire book on leftover paper from food bags or some kind of cement bags. And then after the war, the Russians recognized this, and they took him to Moscow, and he had to copy his book, leave a copy of that in Moscow, and then he could return to Germany.
I love it. And actually, Lorenz is a fascinating figure, and his story keeps evolving. I was talking with Randy earlier today that, when Simon Wiesenthal sent a letter to the Nobel Assembly between the time that he was nominated and the three of them were nominated and the prize happened, because he said, look, you cannot give the prize to Lorenz, especially in light of some of the writing that he did. But it hadn't all been translated. What he was writing between 40 and 44 was still in German. And what's happened in the last few years is they have been translated. The University of Salzburg in 2014 took away his PhD because he lied about his past. However, it's a really interesting story about his ability to, as I understand it, most of the German soldiers and the Nazis who were captured by the Soviets met a very bad fate. Most of them didn't survive. And he walked out of the POW camp holding a manuscript and apparently looking pretty good. So, there you go. Yes.
Hi, I was wondering if you could say more about what they've learned about dogs and how that pertains to how that has encouraged what you've learned about human psychological problems.
Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting. So, there is in terms of the dogs and resilience. So there is an emerging field that is, I think it's a fantastic field on lots of levels. That's looking at number one, dog cognition, and a lot with autonomic synchronization and autonomic entrainment between dogs and owners as a way of understanding a number of things. But the piece that's really interesting is looking at psychopathology in adult dogs and what happened to them when they were young. So one big issue is that if they are shelter dogs or abandoned, that is a bad prognosis. I mean, to simplify things, if it happens in humans, it basically is parallel, not completely. But one of the really interesting pieces of it, which goes back to actually attachment theory, which another piece of this story is that John Bowlby was a psychoanalyst of Nico Tinbergean. John Bowlby, as you probably know, was the father of attachment theory. But dogs who are taken from their moms, pups who are taken from their moms before the appropriate interval, have essentially attachment disorder and have a higher incidence of aggression and difficulties with socialization later in life, which actually is a huge issue because the leading reason that dogs are relinquished to shelters is behavioral problems that families can't handle. And in most cities and states in the U.S., relinquishment to a shelter equals death, euthanasia. So it's there's some fascinating parallels. I have the papers with me and happy to share. Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what happens when you manipulate the serotonin in animals and that have status hierarchies and also in humans?
Right. So it's a really it's really fascinating. Some of this stuff has actually been done in nature, and some of it by natural experiments, and some is done in the lab. So, for the example, the Riken Institute, the zebrafish studies that look at so the idea is that these two fish are fighting. There's a winner and a loser. There's a neurobiological change in a winner that's unique and different from the change in the brain of the loser, which we see behaviorally. We don't know how they feel, right? But that's what we see. If you put fluoxetine in the tank, Prozac, an SSRI, you actually, there's a lot of variation. So I'm going to make a generalization, and it's not completely true, but you do see sometimes subordinates behave in a less their behavior is less subordinate. In other words, they're acting as though higher status.
So could you just say what does an SSRI do?
Oh, so an SSRI, so Prozac is an SSRI, Lexapro, Paxil. These are the most, the biological, the revolution of biological psychiatry. There was no revolution when we were prescribing drugs that were making, it was the most important antidepressant until Prozac could cause a fatal cardiac arrhythmia. We sometimes had to admit patients to the hospital in order to prevent that. So when the SSRIs it came onto the scene, it was they were created. I mean, the point was that by elevating available serotonin, and again, in saying this, I'm simplifying it, but essentially they decrease the amount of reuptake of serotonin in the synapse so that there's more bioavailability of serotonin, which contributes to presumably the anti-anxiety effects and the antidepressant effects. I mean, I'm not a psychopharmacologist, but that's the basic idea. So the concept is giving Prozac to the fish on the bottom. We don't know if it makes him feel any better, but it does something to the neurobiology that seems to change the behavior.
And you had an example in the book about crayfish, right?
In nature, yeah, in well, you see this in, I mean, there are studies that look at this in lobsters and in crayfish with SSRIs, but the other really interesting thing that's going on in Sweden, there are these rivers that have, there's a lot of fish agriculture in Scandinavia, and there are waterways that have been really polluted with a lot of human pharmaceuticals in general, but psychopharmaceuticals. And so there was concern that prey and predator were beginning to behave differently. And there's a fascinating and emerging literature about if you're a prey species, how having Prozac in your system tends to make you more relaxed and less vigilant. And so people had expected that would cause higher mortality, except they ended up studying this. And it turned out when the predator also was being exposed to the serotonin, they were less aggressive. So this kind of new equilibrium emerged.
Any other questions? Okay, all right. I think we'll
Thank you.